Neil, why is it that after 40 years of what we might call modern sales methodology, we're still struggling today with the same challenges that we faced 40 years ago?
Well, there's a bunch of reasons, of which probably the biggest is one of the hardest things in the whole of business is changing sales performance. It's highly resistant to change, mostly because salespeople are out there as individuals, doing individual things. They practice a set of skills and they tend to cling to them, so they don't change very readily. And also because sales management, which is the engine of change, often doesn't quite know how to set about it.
It's a real challenge for sales managers to sometimes understand that when they've been promoted from rep to manager, that the role is quite different.
Yes, it's a very different role. And I think one of the unfortunate things in many organizations is that very good salespeople were forced to become sales managers because it was the only way to move forward in their career. One of the things I do if I'm redesigning a sales organization, I usually make sure that people take a pay cut to become a sales manager. So I'd much rather that people went into sales management because they wanted to go into sales management than they were forced into it because they were a good salesperson who's now become someone who's doing a completely different job, which doesn't use the same skills at all.
So many times salespeople see it as a rite of passage, don't they? You know, or a way out of the frying pan. You know,
yes.
So that they can deflect blame to a team instead of it being on them.
Foolishly, they think they're getting an easier life when they become a sales manager.
That's right.
And of
That's
course,
right.
it's just the opposite.
And of course, being last man standing isn't a qualification to be promoted to manager. So let's look at an example of what happens when a sales manager moves from the field to management. One of the challenges is that as a salesperson, you have to be something of a lone wolf hunter, very focused on your own areas of business, bringing in your own numbers. Now, when you change to be a sales manager, of course, that role is quite different. The psychology of it shifts somewhat. What are your thoughts on how different that is?
It depends to some degree on the type of sale you're in. If you're in a fairly small sale, then your role as a sales manager really becomes one of driving the team. You no longer talk to customers. In fact, in Xerox they used to have a saying, don't keep a dog and bark yourself. So when you become a sales manager, you become remote from customers and you just manage the activity of a group of salespeople. But that works very well in small sales. As we enter into bigger and more complex sales, you still have a selling role. You're going to support your team on their selling strategy with individuals. You're going to actually go on key calls to customers. And so you're blending two roles. You're blending the crucial role of managing a team of people and helping them. But you also yourself periodically have to have a selling role. Now, one of the dilemmas about a sales manager is how you keep your main role, which is helping your people, helping them with their strategy, with their skills, with the way they plan, how you keep that as your number one role, and you don't get diverted too much into the thing you often really would like to do, and that is being in there with customers and closing the major sales.
Well, it's so familiar for so many salespeople to go back into being super rep, you know, to charge in and save the day at the end of quarter. And of course, sometimes it helps bring short-term revenue, but it doesn't really build competency in the sales team for the long term if nobody's coaching and showing how that's done.
Yes, it's a dangerous role, but it's a necessary role. It's dangerous in a number of ways. If as a manager you get yourself into selling, one of the things that tends to happen is you unintentionally undermine your salespeople. That is, you go in on important calls that are near to closing the business, and you show the customer that you have extra authority, that you can make concessions, and in doing so you make your salesperson less important and yourself more important. And you know, some companies have actually thought of ways around that. IBM, for example, always used to have a rule that only the salesperson can make the concessions. So in fact, if the customer said, "No, give us an extra 3% discount and the business is yours," the sales manager wouldn't say, "Done." They turn to their salesperson and say, "Could we do that?" which was a signal to the salesperson, yeah, we can say yes, we can do it. But even though that sounds rather corny, it was a very useful way of making it clear to the customer that the salesperson is the key individual who's in charge of the account, and the sales manager is there to support, not to subvert.
That's very important when you take some of the latest research that shows that what executives are most looking for from the salespeople is somebody who's responsible and accountable for getting the results. So of course, as soon as they cede that to their manager, the customer doesn't need the salesperson anymore.
That's right. And of course, often managers make it worse by saying to the customer, here's my card, call me anytime. In fact, there's a study that shows that 23% of the time of the average business-to-business sales manager is spent in dealing with customers that they first met during the tail end of a sales cycle. In other words, they've trapped themselves forever into being the salesperson for that account.
It's a real dilemma. I mean, if customers had a dirty book of buying secrets, buying tip number 23 might be, always get the sales manager involved because they can give a bigger concession, and then you don't need the rep anymore. I think salespeople sometimes have a dirty book of selling secrets that says, if you've irretrievably lost the sale, get the manager involved, because if they can't close it, you're off the hook. There's some truth in that, I think. So what is there to do with sales managers in terms of how we change the profession so that there's a clear roadmap? Because what we see is that so few sales managers on promotion get anything like a proper induction. Maybe they're given an orientation of how to look at the CRM system as a manager to do their forecasting. Maybe they're given a cursory idea that they need to now go out doing coaching, but nothing particularly prescriptive. And so you get many sales managers in the same organization. Some have coaching as a core part of what they do because they've seen it modeled in the past very well, and so they do what they saw past sales managers do. Others don't do it at all. Others are more focused on the revenue versus the talent. Is there an equilibrium or a balance that they should strike?
I think so. It's very hard for a sales manager. I did a study a few years ago and found there were something like 8,000 books on how to sell. Only 6 books on how to be a sales manager. And actually, most of those were pretty dreadful.
Right.
So the reality is there's not a lot of places where you can go for advice on how to be a sales manager. And we can't historically give sales managers the same degree of help that salespeople can get. So the crucial thing there starts with understanding your role as a sales manager. What's unique and different? What can you do that no one else in the organization can do? So in some companies that I really admire, like for example GE, they've simplified the role of the sales manager into your job is to improve the performance of your sales team. Now, I think if you have that kind of focus, it's much easier to be a good sales manager. If you know what your primary and unique contribution to the business is, improving the performance of a sales team. Now, we did a study a few years ago in Xerox, which showed that the average sales manager, if you look at their job description, has so many things to do that it would take 29 hours a day, 24/7, to do them. We load our sales managers with too many things. The great sales managers are the ones who pick out what's really important. And of all the things a sales manager does, I wouldn't think so much it's a question of balance. I think it's a question of ruthless focus. It's ruthless focus on improving the performance of the sales team.
Now, how much of that needs to be in the field? Because we've seen some recent research that indicates that globally most salespeople are underperforming against their quota, but where their managers are spending a few hours a month with each of the salespeople to show that they're accountable for the results, that management is watching. Why do so few managers spend time doing that?
Yeah. Well, I used to, when I was training sales managers, try a simple little experiment. I'd say, well, we know that skills are learned through practice. You don't learn to play golf by reading a book, or to swim by reading a book. You have to get in the swimming pool or on the golf course. And salespeople have lots of opportunity to practice. So the question is, why aren't they improving? Because we know practice improves. I used to get people to just take a felt pen and draw a line on a flip chart. I'd say draw freehand a line, should we say 17.5 inches long. People would draw a line, and I'd say, okay, well, now we know that practice is important, do it again, but even closer to 17.5. They'd say, how long's this one? And I'd say, well, we're just practicing. And of course they'd draw half a dozen lines, and it wouldn't improve because they didn't have a ruler, they didn't have a measure. And so when you actually measure each line, say, well, that was actually 19 inches, then the drawer knows the next line has to be shorter. So what you find there is, really what you're doing as a manager is you're providing the ruler. You're measuring the lines your salespeople draw. And the only way you can do that is through coaching. So this is why almost every study of the most successful sales organizations in the world in the last 20 years have found that they really put a very strong emphasis on coaching. In other words, measuring the lines that salespeople are drawing in order to get them nearer and nearer to success.
Well, it's a key thing these days to look at lag indicators and lead indicators. Many people look at lag indicators, which is, did you hit your number? And of course, by the time you're inspecting that, it's too late to change the outcome of the sale. So lead indicators are becoming much more important for people to look at. Not always the types of things that a CRM system will throw up on a dashboard. It requires some insight on the part of the manager to know what to look for. So what would you say to a sales management audience are the most important things for them to look at as far as the things that are happening now which are going to create the outcomes 6 or 12 months into the future?
I think one thing is the beginning of the pipeline is more important than the end of the pipeline. You know, as managers who have to produce the numbers, we're automatically focused on the end of the pipeline because that's where we can squeeze some business now. Studies have consistently shown that managers who put more focus on the beginning of the pipeline end up with much higher sales volume as a result. So start the cycle strongly would be the first piece of advice. The other thing is, think of it not as some arcane rocket science, but as using simple, consistent things to help people focus on how they plan sales calls. And for example, just a very simple thing. Before one of your people goes on a key call, just give them a call. Talk to them on the phone for 5 minutes. And ask them questions. My favorite question is to ask, why would the customer write us a check for this call? It forces the salesperson to think about, what am I doing here that's useful to the customer? What value am I creating? But if a manager consistently asks questions like that before the call's likely to go better and to be more successful. Unfortunately, we're very good at asking questions after we've failed. And as you say, that's no longer a leading indicator. It's a rather dismal process.
So the type of sales briefing call where you turn up at the curb and on the way into reception you say, so what are we going to be talking about here, isn't what we would suggest managers be doing.
Yeah, so often planning is an anxiety attack on the way up to the customer's office. You know?
It's true.
And so what we have to do is we have to substitute that with a very conscious planning process. Not necessarily for every call, but for key calls. And that's a very, very good use of a manager's time. Because one of the things that you'll find is there's two kinds of coaching, fundamentally. There's skills coaching and strategy coaching. Skills coaching involves going out with people into calls, watching how they sell, watching the line they draw and measuring it, so to speak. Now, that is very labor intensive, very effective, but very labor intensive. On the other hand, strategy coaching, which is advising people on the direction they should take in a call, and on their overall strategy for this customer, can be done in little 5-minute bursts. You don't have to lead your office. And so one of the things you find is these strategy coaching tools are very powerful just because they're easy and they're quick.